Hey now, NagRVMX here with another SNES RPG review, this time of a more popular game that we definitely got in the mainstream. I mean, heck, it's from Capcom, Breath of Fire. However, I think that even though Breath of Fire was once one of the major RPG series spoken of in the same breath as Final Fantasy or Dragon Quest, it is now diminished greatly due to there not being a console release for a long time. Breath of Fire was a bit of a hit for Capcom, enough so that the SNES got a sequel, then that two more appeared on PlayStation. This was probably the height of the series' popularity. A fifth game was released for PlayStation 2, and although it was good, it was also very different from the rest of the series to a point where it was barely related, and a lot of longtime fans were put off by it. Good game, just kind of jarringly different. For the longest time, the underperformance of Breath of Fire 5 seemed to be the death knell of the series, with a small but dedicated group of people asking Capcom for a Breath of Fire 6. And believe it or not, they eventually delivered. Though they did it in the form of the online social game played in a web browser, it was poorly received for both its poor concept and its poor execution of its concept, and it never made it outside of Japan. Nor did it make it onto any consoles, with the only port outside of the original browser one being a mobile version. So once again, it looks like this series is dormant, though recently on Twitch, I relived the first game that started it all, Breath of Fire: The Dragon Warrior on the SNES. I played it on Friday afternoon streams where I'd revisit games that I had previously played on YouTube ages ago and played it on the Hygan emulator. I should also mention a few things about this game specifically. The first being that there is a Game Boy Advance port that adds a few things, though it's not all that different. It has slightly brighter colors that probably had more to do with the original Game Boy Advance's lack of a backlight, so if you play it on a backlit screen, it actually looks too bright. The game also had some of its art assets updated, but for the most part, it's pretty much the same game. Another thing to mention is that although this is a Capcom game, Square had a hand in it, as evidenced by the opening logos. Capcom developed the title, but were inexperienced at localizing a game with a lot of text, and also at marketing RPGs, so they allowed the North American version to be published by Square, who translated and marketed the game aggressively, suggesting that they had made the game. The translation was headed by Ted Woolsey, who was a bit of a superstar of translations back in the day. So some of his choices seem funny by modern standards. He was able to get a workable translation done in a small amount of time and also keep the ROM size small, which was important for cost. I'll comment on the quality of the translation later, of course. That being said, let's get things started. I'll be rating Breath of Fire on a scale from 1 to 10 in the following categories: graphics and presentation, music and sound effects, story and writing, gameplay and controls, and balance and difficulty. And as always, I'll remind everyone that on my 1 to 10 scale, a 5 is average, not bad, a 7 is good, not average. We good? We good. Lego. So, for graphics, Breath of Fire is a very colorful and bright game. It's the sort of thing that you can instantly recognize as a 90s Capcom title without needing to be told that it's a 90s Capcom title. Although the game was released in the United States in 1994, the initial Japanese release was in 1993. Whenever I make comparisons to other games graphically, by the way, I always go by the Japanese release dates, since that's when the games were created and when the graphics were created. So comparing Breath of Fire to the likes of Lufia, Illusion of Gaia, Secret of Mana, or Ys 4 Mask of the Sun, Breath of Fire wins big for its use of color, large detailed enemy and character sprites, and plenty of animation. I'd say it's on parity with the Illusion of Gaia. Both are great looking games for their time. Some of the character designs were done by Keiji Inafune early on. Though he came off the project in early development, a lot of his initial drawings were still used to design the primary characters. Funny story, on the GameCube release of Mega Man Anniversary Collection, there was a short documentary about Mega Man, and part of it had Inafune talking about character design in the Mega Man series and how it evolved over time. He was showing off sketch pads with art of many Mega Man characters and flipping through them, though pointing at the camera, so he wasn't really seeing what he was showing. At one point, he accidentally chose a pad with Breath of Fire characters and flipped through the whole thing while talking about Mega Man. The characters in the party are all from different clans, essentially different species of anthropomorphized animals, so there's a wide variety of looks here. The characters come in different sizes and shapes, and that leads to a very diverse roster rather than a basic sprite type with different colored hair for each character. that's what some games do, or even different looking characters, but they're all the same size. This is a pretty welcome way of going about things. Although Breath of Fire's graphics are less detailed than, say for example, Illusion of Gaia, there is a bright anime-esque aesthetic to the game that it clings to very well, and with a wide variety of areas and settings to look at. There's also some cool animations for spell effects, something that we take for granted these days, but the longer, more elaborate animations for spells, well, it just wasn't super common back in the day. Occasionally, the game will give you artwork panels for storytelling purposes, or even certain late-game spell effects will show artwork, specifically ones that transform your character. There are some really well-drawn art in these sections, but my only complaint is, well, I wish it happened more often. There's a few cutscenes that use this technique, and it's done so well that I wonder why they didn't use it all the time. The presentation is somewhat of a mixed bag, with a lot of menus and layers to them. Everything is in panels and sub-panels, and it can get a bit cluttered on the screen. It probably could have been cleaned up a bit. Instead of words used for things like fight and item or spell or defend in battle, they use icons, which is cool since they're easily understandable and well made, but the same doesn't apply to the pause menu screens. I think Capcom knew that the pause menu was a bit unwieldy to navigate at times, as you have the option to not only customize buttons for confirm and cancel, but to macro all the other buttons on the SNES pad to shortcuts to open specific parts of the menu, such as spells or items or changing the order of characters. This is useful to avoid having to navigate the menu with all of its animations of panels opening and closing. The presentation isn't bad, it's just over-designed. One thing about the presentation that is great, though, is that representing character and enemy health as being easy to understand health bars rather than numbers, although the numbers are still visible for character's health in case you need to figure out which healing spell would work or if your character is likely to survive an attack, as spells in this game generally do fixed damage. But also, it just looks cool. With bosses, you're not meant to know how much health they have, so they all have a second invisible health bar that kicks in once you deplete the first one. It's not the best way of going about this, but it works to help foster tension in boss battles. Overall, for graphics and presentation, I give Breath of Fire an 8 out of 10. For music and sound effects, well, let's talk about the music first. Breath of Fire has a great soundtrack with sweeping, adventurous music with sort of a Baroque feel. There's a lot of use of woodwinds and harpsichord and organs for the instrumentation. The soundtrack was done by several people, 5 separate composers to be exact, and it's kind of amazing how well it all comes together with so many cooks in the kitchen. Perhaps the most striking talent here is Mari Yamaguchi. She also did the music for Super Ghouls and Ghosts, and Breath of Fire's soundtrack has an extremely similar feel to it. Exciting and adventurous, but with a bit of malice thrown in to put you on edge. Yoko Shimomura, who worked on Street Fighter II, is also present, as well as Yusuke Fujita, who was known for his work on Mega Man. So basically, it's an all-star cast of Capcom composers. The soundtrack is an extremely important part of Breath of Fire. It works in perfect harmony with the gameplay and story to get you feeling what you're supposed to feel. The sound effects are very competent, with great use of the SNES's Sony-designed sound chip, giving bass and reverb to rumbling earthquakes or crushing blows, the sound of fire, striking lightning, a dragon's roar. It's all done very well, though I suspect at least some of the sound effects might have been borrowed from Street Fighter II. That's not necessarily a bad thing, it just kind of gives impact. My only complaint about the audio experience here is that occasionally the sound effects are a bit too bombastic for the purposes that they're put to. Sometimes it works well, like the extremely loud thunk of a sliding door opening or the crushing rumble of a wall being broken. But sometimes a character teleporting away is accompanied by a huge boom, which honestly is almost comical. It's a small nitpick, really. Overall, comparing it to its contemporaries at the time, my tiny nitpick isn't enough to dull the score at all. It's one of the most memorable sound experiences from an RPG at that time, with music as good as Lufia's but better sound effects. For music and sound effects, I give Breath of Fire a 10 out of 10. For story and writing, well, let's talk about the story. In the beginning of the game, on the Attract mode, you're given a backstory about how the Dragon Clan split into 2 factions who waged war against each other, the Light Dragons and the Dark Dragons, and the Dark Dragons are winning. In the beginning of the game, the Dark Dragons attack the last Light Dragon settlement, and the town's protector, Sarah, attempting to fight them off but being captured, Before this, she turns everyone in the town to stone, including her brother Ryu, who is the main character. After the spell wears off, the town is completely razed, but they survive due to Sarah's spell, and Ryu sets off on a journey to find his sister and take down the Dark Dragons and their Emperor Zog. Along the way, he meets all the other characters who have their own motivations for joining. Some just want to stop Zog or protect their people. But what's interesting is that a few of them have selfish reasons, such as Karn, who just wants to prove that he's the best thief in the world, or Gobi, who is looking to profit. The characters banter with each other in light-hearted fashion, and to be honest, other than the very beginning and the very end of the game, it keeps it pretty light and breezy. Even events such as the King of the Fae being poisoned and nearly dying is softened by the fact that as soon as he is administered the proper antidote, he starts jumping on the bed. The light and breezy feeling may contrast to the dark intro, and the fact that there's a world war going on. But well, earlier when talking about graphics, I called the game anime-esque. And the story definitely reflects this. Of course, it's impossible to talk about the story without talking about the translation handled by Square. Now, a lot has changed, mostly for spatial reasons. English text takes up a lot more digital space than Japanese text. If you don't understand what I mean, just try to remember that a Japanese word can be summed up as a single character, whereas it takes several to convey the same thing in English. This means that a lot of things had to be truncated to fit on the ROM. Woolsey did a good job of telling the overall story with what he had to work with. It all comes through pretty loud and clear, though slightly clipped due to the fact that there's a lot less room to convey information. However, the major issue with the translation crops up, and that is that all the characters have 4 character limits to their names. For some, this is fine, like Ryu, Nina, Karn, or Mogu. However, some characters' names were changed, and the changes don't always make sense. Manillo became Gobi when he could have been Manny. Builder became Ox for some reason. Guillaume became Bo. I should mention that in later games, the name Guillaume wound up being localized as Gary. They could have just done that. But the oddest one is Dees, who was changed to Blue, which is the same number of letters, which makes me think that this change is rather arbitrary. The name Blue actually stuck around for the game's sequel, though in Breath of Fire 3 and 4, they changed it back to Dees. Sometimes it's hard to know what an item is, especially pieces of equipment. Items don't seem to have a set limit of characters. A lot of times they crush words together to make them. For example, a coconut is called a C-nut, which, as in the letter C, a dot, and then nut. This shortens a 7-character word to 5. But the item javelin is not shortened at all, and some pieces of equipment are 7 characters long, like Silver DR, short for Silver Dagger. Sometimes it's hard to figure out what a piece of equipment is at all, like World ML. This is supposed to be Earth armor, but they changed armor to male, represented by the ML, which is fine, but literally translated the word Earth to world. They weren't paying attention to the context that it's used in, as it refers to Earth as an elemental force, not as in the world. They could have called it stone armor. People would have immediately understood stone armor. Another issue is that some aspects of the story were just changed for arbitrary reasons, such as censorship or just... well, some I can't figure out at all. There are a few spicy jokes in the Japanese original that were toned down, though in a way that just removes the context. In one scene, you can have Nina, the group's healer, fix an old man's aching back. This scene is amusing because instead of using magic, she gives him a massage, with the dialogue giving us sound effects for pata 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 pat. You can just imagine her slapping the hell out of this guy's back. He feels better, and he gives you a rather nice sum of money for your trouble. Why do I even bother mentioning this? Because the pata pata pat scene is accompanied by a black screen that flashes pink. I never quite understood this until a Japanese friend told me that the pink flashing was meant to indicate that it was a sexy massage. This is something that they might as well have just cut out completely. It doesn't make sense to American players. Another odd bit is that the entire characterization of Sarah, who you reunite with later in the game, but then you wind up having to fight her as a boss. She's being mind controlled by one of the Dark Dragons and occasionally slips out of the mind control and then back into it. I mean, this is fine, but in the Japanese original, she wasn't mind controlled and was in fact conflicted due to the fact that she had fallen in love with the villain. She was conflicted between her love and her brother, who were on opposite sides of the war. Not only was there no reason to change this, but it makes the story worse, turning Sarah into a version of Final Fantasy IV's Kain, rather than letting her have some complexity and inner conflict. This is despite the fact that the forbidden romance between a townsperson named Alan and a demoness named Carla, or Searle in the butchered translation, was left intact, with Carla being conflicted because her loyalty to the Dark Dragons and her anger with humanity in general for treating her poorly, and then there's their love for this one man. It's a rather poignant moment in the game, and was done pretty well. So why was Sarah's character so badly butchered by the localization? I could go on and on listing changes made to the game that just don't make any logical sense, because there's a lot of them. The inconsistent and haphazard translation was clearly rushed, and they clearly truncated things that they didn't need to while leaving other things intact that could have been changed. The confusing names for people and items in the world, coupled with the stilted script, just shows that while Breath of Fire has quite a good story, the writing, at least in the American version, suffers greatly, especially compared to Lufia, which also came out in 1993. For story and writing, I give Breath of Fire a 4 out of 10. For gameplay and controls, well, Breath of Fire is a fairly standard turn-based RPG, and if you played any of them, you know what you're getting into. Battles work in a similar way to Dragon Quest. Everything works the way that it needs to and is easy to understand. There's a few ideas that are undercooked, such as hunting animals or fishing. Both of these ideas would be better implemented by the sequels. But for the most part, the gameplay progression is extremely standard. I mentioned macros early on, and this is something that I have to praise, although the reasoning for including them is suspect, the actual implementation is welcome. You can choose which buttons you want to confirm and cancel, and then you have 2 more face buttons and both shoulder buttons to open any part of the menu that you wish. So if you want to quickly access magic with the X button, you can do that. It's easy to switch rows in battle, and once you have more than 4 characters, you can swap any of the 4 you have in battle for ones that are in reserve. You can do this once at the beginning of each turn, although all party members gain reserve experience, you can choose your 4 mains based on who you like. Once you have 5 characters, you need not even use Ryu if you don't want to. There are some gameplay innovations here though, such as shamanization, where one character, in this case Karn, can magically merge with others to create new and powerful characters. For example, Karn can merge with Gobi and Bo to create Shin, who is basically a more powerful version of Bo. Nearly all the characters also have passive abilities that can be used on the overworld, such as shooting arrows, fishing, being able to walk through otherwise impassable forests, digging holes to find items or even underground areas, or punching trees or weak walls. This gives you an opportunity to use every character for purposes that aren't related to battle. Sometimes even the shamanized super characters have these passive skills. Some, like Shin's shooting arrows and walking through forest, are based on the characters that they include. These are both things that Bo can do, however, some are unique, such as Puka being able to breathe on certain panels to open them. It's the only way to do so, or Doof being able to push certain objects. This makes the overall gameplay slightly more engaging, and it's a welcome change and also something that would become an ongoing theme in the series. Although the gameplay in Breath of Fire isn't as specialized as its sequels, the series would eventually have its own unique feel. It is on the right track, basically starting the series off with a familiar feeling RPG with some unique twists. Another cool feature is when shopping, you can directly trade your equipped item with the one you want, which even works if you don't necessarily have enough cash on hand to cover it. It basically sells your equipped item first and then buys and automatically equips the new one, though of course it will only let you do that if selling the item would give you enough money for the trade. It's a pretty easy game to just pick up and play at any point, though occasionally progression might be halted by not being familiar with what the characters can do. For example, by the time you need a coconut to continue, you might be familiar with Ox's ability to break down walls by punching them, but you may not have figured out that you can punch trees to make fruit fall from them. This is actually the only part in the game where it's an issue. You need that coconut and a few other ingredients to make an elixir to cure amnesia. You also need a poison fish, which is easy enough to figure out. You have access to poison water that you can fish from. For the root item, you're told that it's in an arid area, and you might have Mogu dig up every single square of the game's rather large desert, only to find out that it's actually in a much smaller arid area. The worst of it is the white antler, which you can find 2 of in the game by checking drawers and such in towns, but if you use them as items to replenish ability points or sold them for cash, you now have to hunt a white deer, something that is easier said than done, as animals appear rarely and the white deer is one of the rarest. You'll also need to buy items to prevent random encounters, as they will reset what animals, if any, are nearby, and hope that the deer appears in a spot that you can actually get to. And since they're hard to hit, you probably need to use Shin. A player might spend hours trying to get the white deer to appear in a spot that they can get it. That's really the only bad part of progression, however. And if you go in knowing that you'll need the white antler, you can just save one of the ones you find. But if it's the first time you're playing it, it's unlikely that you would know this. For gameplay, Breath of Fire has a familiar feel, more so than its sequels that would lean more towards the uniqueness of the series, but this means that it's something that's easy to pick up and play with only one progression stalling flaw that will majorly annoy you if you're unprepared for it. For gameplay and controls, I give Breath of Fire a 7 out of 10. For balance and difficulty, Breath of Fire follows a pretty linear path through the world until late game when you have the ability to fly, and follows a basic formula for rather easy progression, occasionally stopped by a wake-up boss. You'll find that you rarely, if ever, need to grind to defeat enemies or even bosses or afford equipment in a store. There are a few scant points you might need to stop and grind. The first is for the game's first wake-up boss, a gremlin that will likely tear an inexperienced party apart. This happens only a few hours in, when enemies don't give a lot of experience, so you may be stopped for a while here, though with smart use of items and strategy he can be beaten. It's definitely the toughest encounter for a long time. Another part is when you first reach the city of Prima, which has a lot of weapon, item, and armor shops, all with different pricing and different items. You might buy a new weapon for a character only to find an even better one available in a different shop in the same city. This one I don't mind as much, as the entire point of Prima is the hyper-capitalistic fish people are obsessed with commerce, and you're forced to comparison shop when faced with a lot of options. As a matter of fact, even basic items range in price depending on who is selling you them, and how much you can get for selling items depends on the merchant too, and this just doesn't apply to Prima but to the entire game. Both extremes are found in the city of Aurea, the rich people's city that is literally paved with gold. In Aurea, there are 2 fish merchants. The yellow guy is the cheapest jerk in the game, selling items at inflated prices while offering lower prices than any other when you sell him things. Ironically, this is the guy that joins your party. The green guy, however, sells items at a pretty good discount and is the best merchant in the game to sell things to. Basically, what I'm getting at is that although you'll occasionally run into a difficulty spike, there's ways to game the system. Another example is the Slime X boss. It's a group of 3 powerful slimes that merge into one. This boss can prove very difficult because their gigantic pool of hit points and reused dragon attacks do fixed damage. However, they have very low defense and are weak to physical strikes. So right before this boss, you're presented with an optional, though highly encouraged, side quest to retrieve and repair a weapon that not only has high attack, but strikes all enemies on the screen, quickly deleting the health bars of the 3 slimes. There's an item that you can get that absolutely wrecks certain late game bosses, but is only used once, so you have a choice as to how you go about it. My only real complaint isn't with the occasional difficulty spikes, but the fact that the game is just kinda ultra easy overall, especially at the end. The end game is a walk in the park, as the ability needed to get the best ending is so overpowered that using it on bosses is unfair to the bosses, including the game's final boss. You can, of course, self-impose more of a challenge by not using this ability except to trigger the final boss's final form, but even without it, many late-game bosses don't pose a threat, making Breath of Fire the sort of odd game that is harder in the beginning than it is at the end, when you have to 8 characters with some godlike powers, and it doesn't take a lot of experimenting to find out what works and what doesn't. There's a wide variety of ways to play the game, but some are so overpowered that you'll not experience any others unless you go out of your way to make things hard on yourself. Thankfully, the game being overall too easy doesn't mean that it isn't overall fun, just that the last few bosses aren't that exciting, due to them basically prostrating themselves at you if you have the right abilities. For gameplay and balance, I give Breath of Fire a 7 out of 10. So, overall, Breath of Fire is a good game. It's not immediately impressive other than in the audio department, but it gets the job done and it's worth playing. It would be eclipsed by its sequels, but it's a fun playthrough to return to on occasion, and is a decent start to a series, which I think is reflected in its overall score of 7.2 out of 10. On a personal note, I should also mention that I do prefer the original release over the Game Boy Advance port, mostly for the higher resolution and better colors, though some of the reworked art for the Game Boy version is just fantastic. As I pointed out, the game's best feature is its sound, and I don't need to tell you whether the SNES sound chip or the Game Boy Advance sound chip sounds better.